Hello, I'm Oriana Fox. Thank you for tuning in to Multiple O's, the spin-off podcast for my talk show, The O Show. The O Show is a live performance piece that mines the conventions of daytime TV talk shows for all that they're worth. It features artists and other experts who have no difficulty spilling the beans about their lives and opinions, especially when they defy norms and conventions. So if you're interested in candid confessions, nonconformity, creativity, and mental health, you've come to the right place. Hello, welcome to Multiple O's. I'm your host, Oriana Fox. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you the second half of the conversation I had with Jo Van Every. So this is part 2. It was a two-parter. So if you're just joining me and Jo Van Every now, you'll want to go back and listen to part 1. Jo is a sociologist and coach who wrote the book, Heterosexual Women Changing the Family, Refusing to be a Wife. And Jo and I, in part 1, spoke a lot about the practical things that she has done to live by her feminist values. And at the very end of that conversation, it became apparent that that kind of individual personal politics would benefit from being supplemented by forms of activism. And I asked Jo, what political activism do you think is most important for feminists to be pursuing?
I always hate the questions like most important or what's your favorite or like I hate those because I sort of feel
or
like...
not maybe what are some of the...
I think some of the things, I think one of the ones is really around things like pensions and social... and unemployment benefit, like all the benefits stuff.
Yeah, social welfare. Yeah.
Right? Like all of that. I think what the Tories have done over, since Thatcher, and we're now into like the late stage of whatever that ideology was, and really seeing...
Neoliberalism.
Yeah, we're really seeing the implications of it. But, I remember when I was an undergraduate in the 80s doing a course about social policy and housing policy and stuff, and reading a figure that's kind of stuck with me that something like 60% of people in the UK lived in publicly owned housing. Right?
I know. I was really surprised by those statistics
it was very
in your
high,
book.
Right?
Yeah.
It was very high.
Also, the median income was very low in 1990, whatever it was when you were writing. I was shocked by the number that it was so low what people earned. I don't know.
But the public housing thing, right? Like compared to, say, the US or Canada, where that's always been a sort of last resort just for the most needy, right? In this country, it wasn't, right? Mm-hmm. The post-war saw a massive expansion of publicly owned housing, which meant that, a lot of people, yes, they were renting, but they had security. They had they had security of tenure. They were able to decorate their house, like all of that kind of thing. There were ways that if you had to move somewhere for a job, you could like swap your council house here for a council house, right? Like there was a whole system, right? And basically, starting with Thatcher, they started selling all that off. Some of it is still in, housing associations. So they're not publicly owned, but they aren't privately owned, right? They're like, but also just the percentage is so much lower. And that whole ideology of the property owning democracy, right? Well, then what you get is this inherent contradiction between you as a homeowner, where your home is actually an investment and the equity matters, and where, the whole way you're sold the mortgage and everything else is on the basis that it is going to increase in value and therefore, blah, 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 mm-hmm. right? And the idea that even people that don't earn very much money deserve to live in good circumstances and have some security of tenure, right? Like that's an inherent contradiction in this kind of housing policy that's based around ownership, right? And so that now what you have is a lot of private landlords, you have a lot of, right? And then so all of that happens, and then Airbnb, like just the technological ability that makes it super easy for you to rent your home, right? And obviously renting it out short term to people on holiday will get you possibly more than having long-term tenants and whatever. Then all of a sudden you have this huge crisis in so many places, right? But that's not because of Airbnb. Airbnb just kind of took something that was already a problem and just blew it up. Like, just like I think, everything we've seen in this pandemic, like, I don't think the pandemic broke anything. I think the pandemic is like, have you ever lived in a Victorian house that has wood chip wallpaper?
No,
like,
I
seriously.
haven't.
Okay. And you have friends, right? Like that wood chip wallpaper. You know that wood chip wallpaper?
What do you mean by wood chip wallpaper?
It's like, it's bubbly. It's got bits of wood chip embedded in the wallpaper. And it's like a textured wallpaper. It's in a lot of older homes. Maybe people have started getting rid of it. But the fact is, here's the rule about it, is if you live in a house that has that kind of ugly wallpaper, you should never rip it off. Because what you think is, oh, it's just wallpaper. I'll rip it off. I'll paint the plaster. I'll put new, right?
Yeah.
That wallpaper is holding the wall together 90% of the time. Okay?
Oh.
The reason they used that wallpaper is because the wall was kind of uneven, right? And so unless you're prepared to maybe increase your budget to get a guy to come in and plaster skim the whole wall, you never want to take that wallpaper off. You just want to paint over it and live with the fact that it's bumpy and maybe not the most trendy thing going, right? So I tell you this because that's what the pandemic did, right? I think before the pandemic, we were sitting here thinking, okay, some things are bad. Maybe there's a crack. Maybe, but it's just superficial, a little bit of polyfilla that'll fix. It'll be fine, right? Pandemic came, ripped the wallpaper off. Oh no, it's crumbling. Actually, I have a funny feeling there's been some subsidence and the whole side of the house is gone. And really, this is like, the roof's going to fall off. Damn it, now I need an engineer and an RSJ. And right, like that's what's happened in the pandemic. Don't you think?
Yeah, that's
right?
very good.
It's like academic workloads. Like the day before, I remember... the day my partner got the email on his phone saying, on Monday, we are going to be teaching remotely, he had been on a picket line protesting workload. Like, the pandemic didn't make academic workloads unsustainable. They were already so unsustainable. People were prepared to go on strike for them up and down this country. And then, despite that, they were like, oh, you've been on a picket line, but Monday, even though today's Friday and Saturday and Sunday are technically not work days, but I know you all pretend that you don't really get weekends, you're going to be working on Monday in a completely new way, in a completely, right?
Yeah.
And then what have we seen? We've seen all kinds of women leaving their jobs to look after their kids. We've seen that situation where it's like, well, it's impossible to look after your small children and do your job. So either it's women's careers that are struggling or they're the ones that are giving up their careers because, but his job is so much more important. It pays the mortgage. Mine just pays for the childcare. Or the extras or whatever it is, right? And it's like, the money that comes in, it doesn't have anything written on it.
It's fungible. That's the whole thing about money.
It's
money
the whole
is
thing
fungible.
about money, right? All that bit about his money being more important than your money, that's all in your heads. But it's in our collective heads, and that doesn't mean that we can just be like, oh, maybe it isn't. Like, it's actual hard work to make it not have that. But I think what's really happened is, we've seen how much we do value certain things, and wow, this government really doesn't. Or, like the whole thing with the nurses' non-pay rise, right? And how many people, even when they were having to say, but, they don't do it for the money. It's like, I don't care if they do it for the money. The work is valuable, and the money is how we show how valuable the work is. That's how capitalism works, right? Money has a symbolic sort of function. Quite on top of the fact that nurses still need to eat.
Yeah.
So, it's hard. But yeah. So I don't know where we got to. We kind of went around in a, and I got on a bit of a rant about...
Well, that was a good rant. I appreciated it. But yeah, there was something else, because you mentioned having a cleaner, and I've had cleaners on and off at different points. Now I currently clean my own home, but I do it sporadically. Low standards, as you say.
Yeah.
But Yeah, and I've also had childminders for my children and stuff. But that's what I wanted to say, is that both of the childminders I had lived in council flats. So I felt like, and basically how it worked was that I paid them from my earnings, which meant that we ended up earning the same amount. Like basically it would split my pay in half and she'd get half and I'd get the other half. And so I felt like, okay, so we're earning the same amount. That seems fair for the same number of hours of work, I guess, essentially. But I mean, I could never afford it full time. It was just like 2 or 3 days a week, anyway. But so while my housing was subsidized by my partner, their housing was subsidized by the government. So,
it's a huge, right?
But in America, that would not be the case. I mean,
no,
she'd be really, or she'd either have to have a partner, or he or she, if it was could be a male nanny or whatever it is. Yeah, I mean, it'd just be.
The structure of the whole thing, like that's what I mean about. Even when there are choices where you feel like, well, I value this work. And I think that if somebody who really enjoys looking after children, which I hope, like, it would be ideal if the people that were doing childcare as a profession were people who were like, I just really love spending a lot of time with children, right? Like, as opposed to this is the only thing I can do given the other, whatever, which is some of what's going on. But if we think about it in that kind of idealized sense, right, it's like there's all these different kinds of work that have to happen. A division of labor is not necessarily a good or a bad thing, right? It's just, especially if it means that I get to do art and you get to do a lot of like hanging out with children. I mean, I use daycare for my dogs. And they love it, right? like they get stuff out of that they would not get with me because they're huge and they really like to play with other dogs. But one of my dogs is a bit anxious, so he much prefers to play with other dogs that he really knows already. So daycare is better because they're all known dogs. And also, if you're at daycare and you're a big dog playing the way big dogs play, nobody freaks out, unlike in the park. So because big dogs playing sometimes looks a little bit scary. But, that's the thing. It's like they love being with dogs. They love spending all day outside, even in like ridiculous weather. That's kind of their jam. So they're basically making a living looking after other people's dogs so that the rest of us can like spend time with our dogs and enjoy our dogs without feeling like we're not giving them what they need. Whatever. The same with, so and the woman, I think you can think, well, yeah, a lot of people are doing cleaning because they have no options and they're being paid really badly because people are exploiting it and because as a society, we tend not to value it. And there's all those things going on. And yet, one of the women, she doesn't come anymore, but one of the women I met through my knitting group, she has been cleaning. Her daughter's the same age as mine, and she's been cleaning since her daughter was little because she was a single mom and she wanted to pick her kids up. She wanted to pick her daughter up from school and actually doing cleaning, domestic cleaning, and she takes in some ironing and stuff for people. But that was a way that she could basically earn a living and support herself and her daughter while still being able to do the things she wanted to do with her daughter. And I think the gap between housing prices, like what's happened with house price inflation has probably meant that in the 20 years since 24 years since she started doing that, the ability to do that has shifted quite a lot because she does have quite a nice house. But that comes back to the thing about why are we all in this sort of, housing as investment sort of policy rather than people need to be able to afford a nice house, even if what they're contributing to the economy is, cleaning or childcare or whatever that's enabling somebody else to do this other thing, right? And so, part of it is that, right? It's like, how do we value this work? Why are nurses earning so little? Like, that has nothing to do with whether we should hire nurses or not. That's got everything to do with, we should value this work better. And so I think that's, and certainly one of the cleaner I have now, fairly young woman with kids who basically has taken the opportunity of her husband being furloughed to set up her own business. She now hires 2 other women, right? And she's being able to do this and, and she's providing employment in the local area. These people are not having to commute to, whatever. And, I think as long as people are being treated well and paid properly and that kind of thing. So I think one of the problems is if you feel like I'm going to hire somebody else to do this work, but I'm going to really cheap out. I don't want to pay very much for it. Well, that's when you need to question yourself.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah.
I think that's part of it, right? Is like, and I think there's also the question of, how did paying for the childcare end up being about enabling your work as opposed to
enabling
we as a
both
couple?
Of our work.
Yeah, but we as a couple have children, and children need. So I've never been. So like I said, my kids went to nursery before I went back to work, and she stayed full time even when I was working 4 days. And part of it is that I just think just like the doggy daycare is good for my kids, going to daycare was good for my daughter. Now, not all kids really like that social environment, but I never was like, I need it to be like it would be if she was home alone with me. It's more like she gets stuff from daycare that I cannot give her.
Yeah. Well, the social interaction with other children is really
friends,
important.
But also just people spending all, because if you're a stay-at-home, even
people
if you're a
paying attention to them, like
you're a stay-at-home
really
mom, are you
about...
actually sitting on the floor playing with your kid all day? Or are you like, could you go do some things while I get the whatever? And so it's like that, right? And again, like for some women, that whole thing, they love that. They're really focused, right? It just wasn't me. And it doesn't mean I'm a bad mother. I'm just a different kind of mother.
Yeah.
And I often and I had the financial ability to write checks for things. So some of the way I mother is like, oh, somebody else is organizing me. Let me write you a check so my daughter can join in.
Yeah.
Other people just really love organizing stuff and either don't have the money to write the check or would rather organize it than pay somebody else to do it. I'm like, fantastic. You're organizing a group thing, That was kind of 90% of my homeschooling strategy. She made some great friends and did because people would hire. We lived in a city with a couple of universities. So it's like when the kids were teens, it's like somebody be like, oh, there's a grad student that could teach like a little 6-week thing about Pride and Prejudice. Who wants to go? And I'll set it all up and I'll pay them. And you know what I mean? And I actually organized one of those once, got a guy to do so, and he loved it. It was a great opportunity for him. He got to spend this time teaching in a thing that wasn't about, you have to meet these kind of things and grade things, no marking. Just can you engage with these kids about ideas around this? They were doing King Lear at the theater, and they used an entirely Indigenous cast. And he had both an English degree and was in and doing some Indigenous studies. I'm like, can you just do some stuff with like a group of teens once a week and then go to the play with them at the end? He's like, awesome. And you'll pay me? And I don't have to grade any papers? You know what I mean? Wouldn't you level your teaching to be like that?
Yes.
Lots high on intellectual engagement, low on bureaucratic bullshit. Woohoo! What's not to like? So I don't know. I think that's part of the thing about that conflict between what you're able to choose and what the structure makes easier or harder. And the compromises you're willing to make around, do I want to have this fight to say that these are his kids and he needs to pay the daycare? I'm not no judgment for not having that argument. I'm just saying
no, we have
you've had
like I said, our only argument is that argument, is around this question. But we had this breakthrough, as I was saying, with our usual fight due to the lockdown, which at first made it worse, but then having to confront that, we kind of got over a snag in our arguments because I had to homeschool by default our kids, and which I don't think I did a great job at and I'm really impressed with what you've described so far that you provided for your own daughter.
One of the issues is whether you're in control of what you're doing in homeschool or whether you're doing what the school is telling you to do, or whether you're completely
I was completely off on a limb. The school did nothing on the first lockdown. The school didn't do anything really, hardly anything to support us. They gave us a ridiculous list of things to do that was completely unrealistic.
But also, it wasn't a choice you made, right? It wasn't you thought. oh, this isn't working. What could we do instead? And you didn't have like a friend who has enabled so many things in your life, but who then went and did a bunch of Google research and sent you loads of online resources about how you could organize it. You didn't have like an email list of other people that had made this choice and were already on the journey who were able to answer your question. Like, you didn't have any of what I had, right?
Well, the lucky thing that I had was like a job that all the workload is in, like, primarily in the beginning half of the year, and therefore I had very little actual work interfering with my time with my children at that.
That was good.
So that was lucky, but at the same time, that was just fueled the resentment to my partner, who wasn't having to do any of that. Because his full-time job just continued, online. So, yeah, I mean, it was like, there was a lot of arguments to begin with, like, just me wanting him to recognize that this was having a bigger negative impact on me than it was on him. Like, I understand that we can't necessarily change anything about this, but I want you to recognize that this is what's happening.
Those are those arguments I was talking about, right? It's like, I don't care if you do this or not. I want you to notice that I did it.
Yeah.
I don't mind doing it,
this is the time
but I
of
would
year.
like it not to be taken for granted and invisible.
Yeah, this is the time of year that I normally would work on my own artistic projects and like my book proposal or whatever it is that I would be working on. It's my work, and this is the time I have in the year to do that, and that has been sacrificed because of the pandemic. And it's like, I want you to recognize that and appreciate this, as opposed to, just going on your computer every day and ignoring that. Like, it just, anyway.
Yeah, it's hard. And that's the thing. It's like, could you notice and let me know that you noticed? Like, that's the hardest argument ever.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's also, and like, there's an impact on, because there's, in my work, there's not a lot of external validation going on.
Yeah.
And so if he belittles it or doesn't, or undervalues it, it like feeds into that self-doubt, self-deprecating thoughts and stuff. And I'm just like, it's hard enough to motivate in the face of a paucity of external rewards. And now I've got to face you belittling or making me feel like what I do is worthless because it doesn't earn or whatever it is. It's this is just compiling. I finally got that through to him, like in this more recent, I don't know, few months. I was just like, recognize this dynamic that's going on, that it's just, anyway, it's...
Yeah, so one of the things as well, like you were saying, does your partner do any, like, so when we were then working, and then he did a 4-day week thing, and we actually bought a small holding that was outside of the city, and he was home more, and he did a lot of stuff. I mean, we were pretty, like, unschooling in our approach. We weren't really structured in a lot of ways, but he did a lot of things. So, like, he has A-level French, and, his grammar and stuff is loads better. So he's the one that taught her French, right? Mm-hmm. Which, they did by reading things like, what's the Paint de la Vie Moderne and that sort of thing in French. Mm-hmm. Because, she was interested in art. And so let's
oh, right. Nice. Oh, Painter of Modern Life. Is that
who is it?
Baudelaire.
Baudelaire, right?
Yes.
She reads Baudelaire in French to learn
Nice.
because she's interested in French and modernity and all that kind of thing. So,
Great.
you don't do that in school, but, so he did a lot of that stuff, so we kind of did all that sort of together. And also sort of, she did a lot of stuff on her own, or, I wrote checks and she went to things and I drove her around.
So when I looked you up, when I like Googled you or whatever, when I first got the book out of the library, I noticed that your coaching at the time, or it seemed to be directed at people who wanted to move out of academia and into some other kind of applying their academic, whatever.
Yeah, there was a little period. Yeah.
And that's what particularly I was like, ooh.
And I don't do that anymore.
That might be me.
Yeah, I don't do that anymore.
Why don't you do that anymore?
So I kind of took a while, like I've cycled through a few things. I kind of had an idea what I wanted to do, but I couldn't really define it. And so it took me a while to figure out what the specific coaching thing is. So for me now, it's more about people who are in academia and helping them make that job work better for them and not sort of burning out while they're doing it. Like, I spend a lot of time encouraging people that it's okay to take the weekend off and not to work evenings and to actually take your holidays and figure out what you can say no to and all that kind of thing. And again, it's one of those things, right? Different people have different choices. Sometimes the choices you have are not all great. And so in a way, it's more about aligning as much as you can your values with the values of the institution and figuring out what room for maneuver you have and really deciding whether this is where you want to be or whether you just need to be doing something completely different. But it's about not just being like, oh, this is what's needed of me. I have to become this thing in order to earn this money, and to really kind of take some of those questions about academic freedom seriously, as opposed to treating it as however some people are treating it. I really don't want to get into that. But I think there is something about, what's attractive about the job to a lot of people is the autonomy. And then they spend a lot of time being like, but somebody has to lower my workload. It's like, well, one of the things is that you have to sometimes you just have to do it yourself. And your perfectionism is getting in the way. And nobody's ever going to make the workload so that you can do everything to your perfectionist standard without burning out. That's kind of like, you know what I mean? And that's a contradiction nobody can do anything about except you and maybe a therapist. I'm not a therapist. I'm a coach. I can help you catch yourself and figure out a different way to take that thought and how to act in a way that is, more in line with where you want things to be. But, there's just right? So that's kind of where I am now. And I'm doing, I'm really enjoying it. People are writing and they're finishing things and they're doing things, and they are almost all women. And many of them have children.
That's interesting.
And it's not like I advertise it as women only or anything. And there are men, and I do have some raving fans who are men, but almost all of them are women. And I think that's partly just about willingness to ask for help, or might be an indication of how just bloody overwhelmed women are.
Right. Yeah. I bought this book actually I think it's called Overwhelmed. The book is called Overwhelmed: How to Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time. And it's by Bridget Schultz. It's super relevant, obviously, to the topic of this podcast. It's just about how everybody is like, busy. It's like the busyness epidemic or whatever.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
People in Montana are busy, but yeah, she's looking at it from like a feminist perspective, and she finds that Denmark and their kind of social welfare system to be the one, or their kind of ethos around work and work-life balance is the one that all of us should be trying to mirror. But obviously, there's always that point that people make about the scale of, Denmark is a relatively small country, and therefore places like...
But it's also about the history and about the culture and about, it's not like we can just be like, oh, here's a thing, we'll just take it off the shelf and it'll fit with us, right? It's like, no.
Yeah.
It's just, there's
But one of the statistics or facts in the book that really struck me was that it's women who work part-time in order to, have time for their kids. They work the most hours of anybody.
Yep.
Yeah. So I thought I was like, oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sucks.
And it's partly because, we have this thing.
And they also feel like they're not doing really well at either one.
Yeah. Oops. Okay.
Yeah. Is that telling you have to do something else?
Yes.
What is the other thing you have to do?
I am talking to my own coach.
Oh, okay. You're a coach with a coach.
Yes.
The plot thickens.
The plot thickens. It's been fun talking to you.
Yeah, it's been really nice talking to you too. I'm trying to think. Oh yeah, I did want to say this. I was just going to do a little plug for you, which is that you can get a hold of used and new copies of Jo Van Every's out-of-print tome, Refusing to Be a Wife, which we'll shorten it to, via the web. And there's also an ebook version available. And if you want to know about her academic coaching services, go to jovanevery.co.uk, where you'll find loads of helpful advice and information for free, as well as details of her paid services. So check those out.
Thank you very much. It was lovely to talk to you. And I'm glad somebody has read my book and thought about it and wanted to talk to me about it and all of that. Because, if there's any academics listening, I would just say, it happens in weird ways. Sometimes people do read that thing you think nobody's going to read. And they read it like 20 years after you published it when it's no good to any of your promotion things anymore. But, that wasn't the only reason any of us wrote it.
That's true. Thank you. That's a very good point to make. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So thank you again. And I'll let you go.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. There you have it, folks. That is the conclusion of my discussion with Jo Van Every, which had a kind of postscript via emails between us, in which she said the following. It was about wanting to connect up her feminist research with what she does now. The connection is that, and I'm quoting Jo here, my feminist principles guide how I do my work. The services I provide to a vast majority of women clients help them figure out how to do meaningful work without just making that the only thing in their lives. So while we focus on academic writing, finding and protecting time for it, using that time effectively, the way I do that is to acknowledge that, for example, choosing to have children was not a bad choice, or taking time to look after elders is not an unreasonable thing. Unquote. So that was Jo talking about her practice. And then she goes on to say, quote, the other consistency is being in this space between personal agency and structural contexts. I'm not doing a lot of activist work, but my work is helping other women find the limits of their own agency and power to create the conditions that make things better for some other women. Because while what we can do individually is limited, it's not insignificant. We don't need to wait for bigger structural changes to happen for things to be better, unquote. So yeah, I think that was a really helpful and positive note to end this podcast with. The other thing that we went on to have an email exchange about, apropos of our conversation, was that I'm not just an academic trying to fit in my academic writing with my teaching job, but I'm trying to fit in academic writing and art. And I was thinking, well, I've also always thought that my backup plan would be to be a therapist. And so I was thinking, well, maybe one day I'll be a coach to some other people like me who are balancing these different, or who are juggling between being artists, academics, teachers, and parents, or other caregiving responsibilities. So that could be a path for me, because maybe I'm certainly the person that needs that coaching. And since Jo has a coach, then maybe I could be a coach with a coach doing that coaching. Just a thought. So perhaps she has helped me to change my career, even though she says she's not. So that's not her forte. So maybe this conversation with Jo Van Every has changed my life. I hope it's changed yours. But if it hasn't, then I'll go on accepting myself unconditionally, my life and other people. And I hope you will too, because we're all just fallible human beings.
Next week on Multiple O's. Next week
on Multiple O's, I'll be speaking with the writer, filmmaker, and cultural critic Juliet Jacques. We'll be speaking about her memoir, Trans, but also her new book, Variations, which has just come out, hot off the press. So that's something to look forward to. Juliet Jacques.
Next week on Multiple O's.
Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to support this series and all my other creative endeavors, please support me via patreon.com/Oriana Fox.